Hi, Deacon Ed McCormick here. This is part 2 of the story of Ignatius of Loyola. Not a full biography of Ignatius, but I want to highlight a couple of important features of his life and how they are reflected in Ignatian spirituality. So last time I concluded with Ignatius recovering from his leg wound at the Loyola Manor House up on the second floor. He's reading the life of Christ, he's reading the lives of the saints, daydreaming about getting back in the Spanish courts, but slowly and gradually his reading of the lives of the saints and the life of Christ begin to impact him, where the Spirit of God starts to raise in him new desires, as well as causing him to look back on his old life now in the light of Christ and the saints in a kind of horror. And so he abandoned his former life in the Spanish courts and decided to head out to Barcelona and then make his way to Jerusalem, where he would live as a penitent. And he eventually arrived in Jerusalem, but beforehand, he stops on his way to Barcelona in a beautiful, extraordinary Benedictine monastery in a place called Montserrat, Mount Serrated, because the mountain in which this monastery is kind of stuffed in, it looks like the mountain is a serrated knife. And Ignatius goes up there, he engages in a spiritual director, he goes to this beautiful statue, a black Madonna, where he offers his sword and his dagger. He has exchanged his wealthy clothes and given them to a poor man. He has bought basically a sack and is wearing the clothing of a beggar. And he sees himself now as having abandoned that former life and taken on this life of a poor pilgrim, a penitent. And he leaves the monastery and goes down to the small village of Manresa, outside of Barcelona. He plans to spend a day or two there, and instead ends up spending about 11 months there, during which he has a series of powerful mystical experiences. These weren't really visions, Ignatius reports, but experiences. And these are all described somewhat tersely in his autobiography. Ignatius describes how one day he has this experience of God creating all things. It was as if he was given these special glasses in which he could see God creating all things at every single moment, and he realized in a fresh new way that everything is a gift from God. Another time, he has this powerful experience of Christ present in the Eucharist, and in a sense being pulled into an experience of the Incarnation. Not in the sense of being back at the time when the Spirit impregnates Mary, but he has this powerful sense that Christ is present in all things, laboring like a farmer, Ignatius says, in the fields of his life and in the world. And Ignatius suddenly feels that Christ is no longer this kind of external model to imitate, but somehow he is in Christ, and Christ is in him, to use Paul's language, and that he has been summoned to be part of Jesus' mission here in the world. And then the last mystical experience I want to mention happened at the Cardinal River, a little kind of muddy river that runs by the town of Manresa. And Ignatius describes making his way to this church to pray, and on the way there he stops by the river, sits down, looks down at the river, and has this profound mystical experience that he says changed him completely. He was afterwards, he says, a man with a new mind and a new heart. And it seems that somehow Ignatius had this experience that pulled all his other mystical experiences together. It seemed to be some kind of an experience in which he sensed God creating all things and coming to us in Christ, and that Christ in his mission is drawing all of creation, all of humanity together to be united in Christ. And Ignatius felt himself summoned to be a part of that, to live out of that, to be of service to that. And consequently, Ignatius now stops imitating the saints. He's only interested in following Jesus. He stops imitating Jesus, but starts to cooperate with him, be his companion, labor and work with him for his mission. Now, after this, Ignatius does go to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, but it's too dangerous, and the Franciscans tell him and the other pilgrims they have to leave. He comes back home and begins to offer people an experience like the one he had. He called these spiritual exercises, various forms of prayer in which people could have experiences of that kind of mystical experience he had, of God creating, of God healing and forgiving our sinful world, of God coming to us in Christ, transforming us, freeing us, and eventually transforming all of creation. Ignatius eventually realizes he has to get educated in order to do the kind of work he wants to do. And he goes eventually to Paris and gets advanced degrees, starts to offer the exercises to people, gathers a group around him, and eventually they engage in a discernment in which they decide it is God's will that they give themselves to the Pope, and they remain a company devoted to the presence and the mission of Jesus. They're known as the Compañía de Jesus. And they go and give themselves to the Pope, and Ignatius spends the rest of his life in Rome, directing the growing and burgeoning society of Jesus. So that's part 2 of Ignatius' life. In my next video, I am going to talk to you about the spiritual exercises, the book that he wrote, and what it means for Ignatian spirituality. See you then.